You're welcome to the course and to the first of a series of audio lectures focused on the subject matter of international trade and finance. This lecture provides you with the basic concepts of the field as well as a conceptual basis for trade. So what's this course all about? International trade and finance is a subfield in economics that focuses on the aggregate production, distribution, and consumption of goods globally, as made possible through trade and finance flows across countries. Coverage is thus divided into two parts. First, we discuss trade relations, and second, we discuss the financial flows that make those trade relations possible. Within the first part of this course, which is international trade, we shall investigate the patterns of trade flows that are observable in practice, seeking to provide a theoretical basis for these observed relations. We next discuss how national policies impact on these patterns. We shall then look at how regional and international trade organizations play a role in influencing the volume and patterns of trade. In the second part of the course, which is international finance, we shall look at how global financial flows which facilitate trade transactions are carried out, as well as the implications of such financial flows on a country's economy and stock of wealth. Global financial flows in a world with different currencies means a measure of currency conversion has to be determined. We shall therefore first take a cursory look at the exchange rate market and then provide a theory for how exchange rates are determined. We shall next discuss how countries typically determine the policy framework that governs the evolution of the exchange rates, that is, the varied exchange rate regimes we observe in practice. Finally, we will see how countries keep track of their international transactions and how changes in those accounts impact on their wealth and stability. Now, here are a few concepts and definitions that shall be used very frequently throughout our coverage. It's important that you're able to define these and understand them in context when they are used. So spend some time and go over these concepts. Okay, let's get back to trade. When it comes to international trade, we can start by observing the global patterns of trade that currently occur across countries. Here we have a depiction for the year 2010. There are arrows going from country to country, region to region, and across continents. The arrows show the direction of exports, and these are all in billions of dollars for trade in goods. Darker or thicker arrows such as from China and Asia to the United States and between Europe and all of Asia reflect very large volumes of trade, while the lighter arrows such as exports from the US to Africa and trade between the US and Japan alone reflect relatively smaller volumes of trade between those countries or regions. Now, while we can surmise that factors like geographical proximity, similarities in culture and heritage, as well as levels of development, might be candidate explanations for such trade flows, we have to ask why sovereign nation states choose to voluntarily engage in such trade relations with other nation states. The answer, of course, is germane to all of economics. Trade is simply a non-coerced, mutually beneficial market transaction. If countries choose to engage, then in the aggregate they stand to gain from it than otherwise. Let's go ahead to demonstrate this with a very simple illustration. Let's consider two countries, home and foreign, and a single product that's assumed to be produced within the two countries and of the same quality, say cloth. We have depicted here the standard market for cloth in home, and as drawn, we assume the market is competitive and clears at a price of $5 per yard of cloth, and there is a resultant equilibrium quantity of 10,000 yards of cloth in this market. Similarly, in foreign, assuming again that competitive markets prevail, a yard of cloth clears at a price of $3.50 and a resulting equilibrium quantity of 20,000 yards of cloth. Of course, for ease of comparison, we have assumed the same currency, or we have already carried out a conversion based on the current exchange rate, so that prices are now measured in the two countries in US dollars. Now, if we allow for trade between home and foreign, and further assume that there are no transaction costs or transportation costs, it's immediately clear that home demand for cloth will fall, as it's now cheaper to buy cloth in foreign. The decrease in demand at home causes home's price to fall, and the increased demand for cloth in foreign causes foreign's price to rise, until the prices are equalized across countries. This is, this is depicted first in home's market. The decrease in demand for cloth in home causes the demand curve to shift down from D to D prime. The result is that at $5 there is now a surplus of cloth in the home market, and this results in home's cloth price falling from $5 to a new equilibrium, say at around $4, and a resulting new equilibrium of 8,000 yards of cloth. Of course, the full story is seen, however, in the sense that it's not so much that home consumers are no longer buying cloth, they are just buying less at home and importing the rest from foreign. So in a true sense, their global demand is still the same demand curve D as before, but at the now lower price of $4, they are demanding 12,000 yards of cloth, 8,000 of which are from the home market, and the difference of 4,000 being cloth imports from foreign at that converged price of $4. Intuitively, I hope we can see why foreign's cloth price has risen from $3.50 to $4. An analysis of the impact of trade involves a comparison of a country's welfare before and after trade. To do this, we compute changes in the total or joint surplus as a result of trade and compare the before and after outcomes. For impacts of trade on consumers and producers, we compute changes in their respective surpluses and compare the before and after outcomes as well. You should be conversant with these concepts of producer surplus, consumer surplus, and joint surplus from a prior course in economics. In any case, here are some of the concepts and their definitions. Focusing on home and isolating the total surplus areas from the market, we can compare the total surplus before trade, that is under autarky, with the total surplus after trade has occurred. These are depicted by the diagrams on the left and right respectively. Visually inspecting, we immediately see that the area in the post-trade picture is larger than that under autarky by the area labeled C. So the joint surplus is bigger under trade than under autarky. Trade therefore increases home's welfare. Of course, when we look at the distributional implications of trade within each country, so in this case within home, we see that the producer surplus labeled in both diagrams as B has fallen, while the consumer surplus labeled in both diagrams as A has increased. In fact, in the second diagram, the consumer surplus is both areas A and C. This means cloth producers in home lose from trade, whereas cloth consumers in home gain from trade. One important lesson here is that trade could, as in this case, create winners and losers. However, because the joint surplus is larger under trade than otherwise, those who gain, in this case home consumers, can fully compensate those who lose, that is, home's producers, and both parties can be made strictly better off compared to the situation before trade. Thus, trade by increasing national welfare could, with carefully planned redistributive policy, potentially result in making everyone ultimately strictly better off than under autarky. This is why we argue that trade provides gains. While this is our first basic demonstration of the gains from trade, The historically dominant position that countries have taken with respect to trade is to be protectionist, that is, to restrict some or all dimensions of trade with other countries, especially with respect to imports. This is often linked to the historical 18th and 19th century economic thought that's referred to as mercantilism. The mercantilist ideology with respect to international trade suggests that a nation becomes wealthier if it's able to accumulate more gold, silver, and precious metals. Trade was therefore a zero-sum game because exports meant more gold would be acquired, and imports meant the need to give up gold and silver in order to pay for those goods. This ideology, however, was challenged by those we now refer to as classical economists. Their views are now central to what's known as modern economic thought, beginning with Adam Smith. According to classical economics, the wealth of a nation is to be seen in expanded consumption capabilities, not in the primitive accumulation of bullion. Through these lenses, trade presented instead opportunities for gains for both countries and could be seen as a positive sum game. Adam Smith demonstrates this using the concept of absolute advantage, showing that trade provided mutual benefits for countries involved. But what is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage in the production of a particular good exists for some country A over some other country B if country A producing the same quantity of that good does so using fewer resources than country B. Analogously, if they both have access to the same amount of resources, absolute advantage for country A means they would be able to produce more goods than country B. Adam Smith's fundamental argument was that countries needed to specialize in producing the good in which they had an absolute advantage in, and by trading for the other good, they would both gain through greater consumption than if they operated under autarky. Let's walk through an illustration of the concept of absolute advantage. Suppose we have a very simple model of the world, where we have just two countries. Let's say they are the United States and India. Two goods that could possibly be produced in the two countries, cloth and machines, and a single homogeneous resource that's assumed to be equal in both countries and is used in producing those goods, call that labor. The table shows us their productive capabilities if all labor is used exclusively in producing either good over a period of one day. It's clear that given our definition of absolute advantage, that the US has an absolute advantage in producing machines, since in a day, with devoting all of labor toward a single good production, 400 machines can be produced in the United States, whereas only 100 can be produced in India. Similarly, India has an absolute advantage in cloth production, since in a day it produces 15,000 yards of cloth compared to only 10,000 yards in the United States. Under the situation where both countries produce both goods for their consumption and without trading with one another, in other words, under autarky, if we assume 2 days of production, with a day set aside to exclusively produce one good, then global production of cloth is 25,000 yards of cloth and global production of machines is 500 machines. In other words, we have 25,000 yards of cloth based on 10,000 yards of cloth from the US and 15,000 yards of cloth from India, and we have 500 machines based on 400 machines produced in the US and 100 machines produced in India. Consider the alternative, where each country specialized in producing over the same 2 days only the good in which they had an absolute advantage in. Then we see that global production of both goods increases over the autarky outcome. We now have the US producing only machines, and so a total of 800 machines over 2 days, and India producing only cloth, and so a total of 30,000 yards of cloth over the same 2 days. Clearly, compared to the situation under autarky, global production has increased. It immediately follows that there is scope for mutual gains from splitting this bigger pie through trade. One such outcome is depicted as follows. The US trades away 300 machines for 12,000 yards of cloth from India. This leaves the US with 500 machines and 12,000 yards of cloth, and India with 18,000 yards of cloth and 300 machines. This post-trade outcome, given specialization based on absolute advantage, increases each country's production capabilities and therefore their consumption possibilities under autarky. Thus, we have demonstrated the claim made by Adam Smith for trade being a positive sum game. Absolute advantage, however, is limiting, since mutual gains are promised only in that rare situation where countries happen to be better in producing a particular good. Another classical economist, David Ricardo, proposed instead that what was required for mutual gains was a much less restrictive concept known as comparative advantage. Even when a country had an absolute advantage in producing all goods in question, it was not likely to have a comparative advantage in all those goods at the same time due to the existence of opportunity costs. Ricardo's argument was that if countries specialized based on where their comparative advantage occurred and then traded with the other country, they would both mutually gain from trade. So let us define what comparative advantage means. Some country A is said to have a comparative advantage over another country B in the production of a particular good if country A can produce the good at a lower opportunity cost than country B. The key here is to realize that if a country is good at producing all goods, it still faces a resource constraint and would be better off focusing its limited resources on what it was best at and trading that for the other things which its trade partners would, in an opportunity cost sense, be better than it at producing. Let's go ahead and illustrate this concept and the resulting gains from specialization and trading based on this. I have reproduced the previous data we worked with, but I've adjusted US cloth production in order to give the US an absolute advantage in both cloth and machine production. This is intentional, as I intend to demonstrate that both countries can still mutually gain from trade than under autarky. The rest of our assumptions carry over from before. Our first step is to compute opportunity costs associated with producing each good. In the United States, over a day, production of 400 machines means giving up 20,000 yards of cloth which could otherwise have been produced that day with the same labor resources. So the opportunity cost at a unit level of one machine is 50 yards of cloth. Analogously, the opportunity cost of a yard of cloth is 0.02 machines. Now, looking at India. In a day, with the focus on machine production, India could produce 100 machines, in which case it gave up 15,000 yards of cloth that would otherwise have been produced. Therefore, at the unit level, the opportunity cost of producing a machine in India is 150 yards of cloth. Similarly, the opportunity cost of a yard of cloth is 0.0067 machines. The next step is to compare opportunity costs for both goods across countries, which we see in the table. Immediately, we see that the US has a lower opportunity cost and hence a comparative advantage in producing machines, whereas India has a lower opportunity cost and hence a comparative advantage in producing cloth. So based on comparative advantage, the US produces only machines and India produces only cloth, and they trade. Let's suppose trade occurs at the rate of one machine for 100 yards of cloth. Then it is intuitive to see why they both gain from trade. The US gains 100 yards of cloth for every machine it produces and trades away. Under autarky, on the other hand, the US would have only been able to manage 50 yards of cloth by giving up a machine in production. India, on the other hand, gains as well. In India, it only has to give up 100 yards of cloth to purchase a machine from the US. Under autarky, to produce that machine, India would have had to give up 150 yards of cloth. So far, I provided just one possible rate of trade, one machine trading for 100 yards of cloth. This rate of trade is formally called the terms of trade, but it's not the only one possible. For mutually beneficial gains from trade, the terms of trade must fall between the two countries' opportunity costs of producing that good. In our illustration, this means any terms of trade at which a machine is traded for anywhere between 50 and 150 yards of cloth would provide mutual gains from trade over the outcome under autarky. This introductory lecture has set the stage for the rest of the course. We've demonstrated using a simple illustration the concepts of absolute and comparative advantage, stressing the latter as the chief basis for mutual gains from trade. This lecture has not particularly focused on any chapter per se, but has taken excerpts from chapter 1 and provided a prelude to chapter 2. You will need to read up chapter 1 on your own. Okay, your next step is to make sure you fully understand the content in this lecture. So go ahead and take the quiz associated with this lecture, and then get ready to listen to lecture 2, which begins a more formal coverage of the Ricardian model of trade. This is chapter 2 content.